In today's podcast for the Root Cause Business of Medicine, our special guest, Dr. Jeff Bland, is somebody that's well known within the functional medicine and integrative medicine world. And it's really fun to have him on today. He's published over 120 peer-reviewed research articles on nutrition. He's written over a dozen books, both geared towards clinicians as well as the public on nutrition and how we can improve our overall lifestyles and health based upon our nutritional approach. So it was really a joy to have him today. And in fact, he recently just published The Paradigm Shifting Future of Healthcare in the IMCG, which is the Integrative Medicine Journal. And we'll have a link for that in our post today. But Davin, what were some of the key takeaways that you got from today's interview or conversation?
Well, I mean, I'm just in awe of this man. You know, he's contributed so much to the field, not just functional medicine, but medicine in general. And hearing his story and how he got started, it's so inspirational. And you know, it's like the who's who of who laid the foundation for the world that we're in. And it's really amazing that he had the foresight and the I don't know, the wherewithal to sort of pursue that against, you know, sort of the collective thinking of the time.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think one of the key things that came up for me today too was this element of resiliency, that things can repair and heal despite what they've been exposed to. And you'll find that part of his story really fascinating, as well as the fact that, like all of us, he had a turning point, and I want you to listen for that, when he decided, okay, time to shift gears and really go after who I really am and what I have to offer the world of medicine and the world in general. Any other thoughts on that?
No, I couldn't agree more. I don't want to steal any more of his thunder. I'll just say that I've attended the Thought Leader Consortium, which is the conference that PLMI hosts, you know, each year, and it's amazing. And both those organizations are a great way, you know, for someone like me to get into self-learning. You know, there's tons of, you know, online courses and videos, as well as those conferences. If you're wanting to learn more about functional and integrative medicine, those are two places where you'll get a lot of information.
Yeah, I love that. And if you're interested in learning more about Jeff Bland, you can go to Jeffrey Bland, drjeffreybland.com, and learn about all the amazing things that he is involved with. And we hope you enjoy today's podcast. Welcome to the Root Cause Business of Medicine podcast, where we explore what's broken in healthcare and what we can do about it. I'm Dr. Erik Lundquist, and I've been practicing functional medicine for the past 15 to 20 years. I'm excited to co-host this podcast with my brother, Dr. Davin Lundquist,
who's just beginning his journey into functional medicine. We come from different points on the path, but we do share a common goal. We want to rethink how medicine is practiced and help others do the same.
The U.S. healthcare system is in crisis, rising costs, declining outcomes, and physician burnout at an all-time high. But you know, we found a different way, another way, a better way.
On this podcast, we dive into real stories from medical professionals who've stepped away from the traditional model, kind of like me, and have found a new purpose in integrative, functional, and alternative approaches to care.
These are authentic conversations with practitioners and friends who redefine success, not just for themselves, but for their patients and communities.
Whether you're a clinician feeling stuck, a student seeking direction, or just curious about what is possible,
you're in the right place. This is the Root Cause Business of Medicine podcast. Welcome to another episode of the Root Cause Business of Medicine podcast, where today we have a special guest, Dr. Jeff Bland, who a lot of us call the father of functional medicine. And I thought it would be great to have Jeff on and give his perspective, his story of the long perspective of this. When you're at the beginning stages of a revolution. Sometimes you don't really have the foresight to see where this is going. I think you did have some of that, Jeff, but I think as you're looking back on it now, you can see probably there were amazing steps, amazing people, amazing circumstances that led you to where you've arrived at today. And I thought it would be really, really helpful for a lot of our listeners who have heard you at conferences, read articles that you've published, to really get a sense for how did that happen for you from the beginning, to evolve into a place where you were able to influence so many significantly in this direction. So thanks for being on the podcast today, Jeff, and we'd love to hear kind of your story from the beginning, and just kind of tell us how you got into the functional medicine field, and how this awoke in you this amazing persona and educator and mentor that we all have appreciated so much.
Well, Erik and Davin, thank you both. I try to condense this because a lot of what is my life is probably very boring, but I think there are some things that are at least interesting as it relates to this trajectory. I'm coming up to my 80th birthday here in a couple of months, so I look back at 8 decades and I think, how did this all unfold? So I'll try to summarize. I think if my mother were still living and you asked her the question, what was I like as a young person, she would say, I was always in search of an answer. I was very curious. And I really wanted to know from early on why people got sick. And, you study infectious disease and you learn something about microbes. And then you start to say, well, look, there are people that get sick that don't have infectious disease. What causes their sickness? And back in the early days of my life, going back now into the 50s and early 60s, the dominant thought was it's all in your genes, right? You have genetics that kind of somehow transforms itself into these disease entities later in life. So we don't know exactly how it happened, but somehow it was in your genes. That was the model. And that never really seemed very satisfying to me, quite honestly. And when I was in college, and I was started off at UCLA, ended up at a new California campus, UC Irvine. I was in the first graduating class there in 1967. And I was very fortunate in being at that new Cal campus that they didn't have a lot of graduate students and postdocs. So we undergraduates got a lot of attention by the faculty that probably would have been paid on their postdocs. So it stimulated, I got involved with research. I worked with Dr. Sherwood Rowland, who was noted and ultimately won a Nobel Prize in chemistry for his discovery of how freon gases were depleting ozone layer. And so it opened up broader questions for me. And here's a guy that was a physical chemist that ultimately became a person who changed the whole course of atmospheric science, basically, and the way people live and the use of refrigerants. And so it broadened my view as to, what kind of questions could you ask and where would you go to find answers, and staying out of silos, trying to think about people with different disciplines and have perspectives. So that then led me ultimately to medical school. And medical school really, it turns out as I look back, probably both because of my age, I got out of college fairly early. So I was only I was only 18 when I got out of college. So I was fairly young to get into medical school. And I think I probably wasn't mature enough to really accept, what you had to do. And I would push back pretty hard on the educational curriculum, which was a lot of memorization. And I kept asking questions, why? And eventually my advisor, my second year said, you're kind of disruptive asking all these questions. And, maybe it'd be better for you to be in a PhD program because you can ask any of the questions you want over there. And so I made that transition in my third year to go into a PhD program, which was the right, I think, decision for me and my personality, because it opened up the opportunity to connect with my medical interests into the into a different level of inquiry.
Right.
That ultimately then, in 1970, got my first academic position at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington, where I was a joint professor of chemistry and environmental science. They were just starting an environmental science program. That was the first year of Earth Day. And a lot of universities were putting environmental science programs into their curriculum. So that was a really great opportunity for me, again, to be stretched, because now I was teaching all sorts of chemistry classes, and I was also building an environmental science program from the ground up. And it turned out in the state of Washington at the time, this is against 1970, it just formed a new department in the state called the Department of Ecology. And so it was becoming our state of Washington was becoming more sensitive to environmental issues and air, water, land use, and so forth. And so I was able to kind of build into that with the development of the environmental science program at the university, a connection into state government and to policies and programs, and get some research projects going, particularly related to, in Tacoma, Washington, the largest copper smelter in the Western United States, which was the major source of sulfur oxide pollution in the whole Pacific Northwest.
Wow.
And the Tacoma smelter, as it was called, was a SARCO, American Smelting and Refining, had a history of 60 years on this facility on the water that ultimately became a Superfund site because of all the arsenic pollution and all the tailings from the smelter that had gone into the water. And so we started measuring atmospheric pollution. And at first it was kind of a fugitive operation because they didn't want us on the property. And so we had to kind of stealth in at night and put our measuring equipment out and then run back before it got too light and we were found out. But ultimately, we were able to identify that there was very, very high arsenic levels of pollutants in the air, and they would only turn on this part of the plant, the arsenic oxide production part of the plant, when it was dark, and because it would produce a bunch of gases that they didn't want people to know about, and it would. They actually had a relationship with the community there, this small mining community. It was a suburb of Tacoma, Washington, such that if there was an inversion layer and the pollution at night got close to the ground, it would kill the lawns. And they ended up having a deal with the people that lived there. They replaced the lawns if the lawns were all dead. People weren't asking the question about their lungs. They were asking the question about their lawns. And so ultimately, we met in the Department of Ecology, the medical director, I still remember him very well, Sam Milham was his name. And he got very concerned about kids' health because there were two elementary schools that were right down, an elementary school and a middle school, right down from the stack. The tall stack was the largest smokestack in the Western United States, because they felt this was the solution to pollution is dilution, right? Was their thought. You just build a taller stack and spread it wider. And what he worried about were the kids in the elementary school that was just across the block, actually, from the smokestack, were being impaired. So he started getting urine samples, and we started analyzing them, and we found a very, very high level of arsenic in the urine of these kids. And so we then formed a group called the Group Against Smog and Pollution, GASP, GASP, with the Washington Lung Association, and started to collaborate with Sam Milham and the Department of Ecology in trying to get the smelter to recognize its responsibility to clean up its act. This became a 60 minutes story in which they traipsed around in the plant with all the arsenic oxide, the white powder all around, and interviewing some of the workers in the plant that had nasal perforations and had various kinds of cancers. So it became quite a national issue. This was in the early 1970s. And ultimately, there was a big trial, which we were representing the plaintiffs, and the smelter was defending itself. They brought all their attorneys in. I think they had 16 attorneys for these hearings that were down there on the smelter property, actually. And the long and short of it is eventually the smelter recognized that it was going to be more expensive than they could justify to clean up the plant. And they would have to do electrolyte refining, and it was just more costly than they were willing to do. They could move the plant to the Philippines and do it there. So they shut down the plant and became a Superfund site. And it took, what is it now? Well, the better part of 25, maybe 30 years to clean it up. Now it's become a beautiful part of Tacoma. It's the longest shoreside park, I think, of any city in the Western United States. It connects to Point Defiance Park all the way downtown. It's a beautiful, now kind of regraded, but they had to take everything out and redo it. So that was a real education for me across the area of health, of the broad kind of, because it goes from public health to individual health when you're starting to talk to these people. And then you see how people rationalize it. The historical people were saying, their medical people were saying the reason these kids had high urinary arsenic was that on Friday they were given fish in the cafeteria. And so they were having fish-related arsenic in their urine. Had nothing to do with the air they were breathing.
Yeah, and
so
I wonder
I
where
learned that you can rationalize a lot of things.
And where did the fish get the arsenic, right?
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. So that ultimately then led me into doing quite a bit of work in the area of nutrition that I never ever thought that I would be pulled into. And that was a consequence of my first graduate student who wanted to do work on vitamin E, which took us into the whole field of antioxidants and oxidative stress. We wrote articles in the the mid 70s actually on oxidative stress and free radical oxidation and, free radical aging. And so that got me onto the lecture circuit, started talking with physicians about this. And I found out in the 70s that you start talking about these areas and it was like a blank stare. I mean, docs didn't have any idea about these things at all. And so I took that on as a challenge. And so we started to do more work in different types of nutrition research and publishing, including essential fatty acids in the late 70s, omega-3s. And that ultimately got me to be appointed as the president of the Northwest Academy of Preventive Medicine in Seattle, which was my first real job of organizing physicians around educational programs. And we started bringing speakers in. We had Linus Pauling as our keynote speaker for the first meeting. And that got me into inviting different people to come speak that had all sorts of interesting, different perspectives than I had been educated about. And at one of those meetings, I met who is now my lifelong friend and surrogate brother, David Jones. And we were both sitting next to one another. We didn't know one another at all. He was a medical doctor from Ashland, Oregon, about the same age as I was at the time. We were young Turks at that time. And at the break, we were just informally introducing one another to each other. And one of us said, this conference, I think could be done a lot better. I think we could make a better conference. And so he and I talked throughout the 2 days of the conference, and eventually we made the decision, okay, then let's do that. Let's kind of take over the Northwest Academy of Preventive Medicine. He formed the Southern Academy of Preventive Medicine in Ashland, and we started doing our own programs, basically. And that was really a tremendous step for me because David Jones is one of the most thoughtful, engaged, committed family docs that I've ever met. I mean, his relationship with his patients was superb, and he was always, he was a young Turk. He was a thorn in the saddle of the local medical people because he was thinking differently and doing different things. And so he and I think, really had a valued collaboration because he could bring his medical thoughts about being a doc to my biochemical kind of science geekism to form this kind of new thought process. And then the third part of it, of course, was the fortune I had to be married to a woman who was had her master's degree in management, Susan Bland, and who said, Jeff, you're traveling a whole bunch and you're meeting all these interesting people. And you keep talking about what this system could be like. Maybe we ought to host a meeting. This is 1989, in which you bring some of these people in, invite them if they want to come in, and we'll have a whiteboard discussion about what would the ideal healthcare system look like if you took licensure and reimbursement out. You just talked about what would be the attributes. And so that was 1989 was the first meeting she put together in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, on Vancouver Island. And we had about 45 people come in from different disciplines, people that I'd met around the world. And it turned out to be a really successful discussion. So successful, people said, let's do it again next year. So in 1990, we did it again. And it was then that I came up with the concept that what we've been talking about was function. And I said, maybe we should call this functional medicine. And the group pretty much pushed back on that because they said, well, I could see why you picked that word. But, if you think of the way function was considered in 1990 in medicine, it was either geriatric rehabilitative medicine or it was psychosomatic medicine. It's all in your mind, functional. So it doesn't have a really great reputation. But I said, I've been watching the literature and I'm seeing articles now that are talking about functional endocrinology, functional radiology, functional cardiology. So maybe it's going to change its definition based on new science. And so, maybe because we hosted the meeting, people kind of gave in and said, okay, let's give it a whirl. We're going to call it functional medicine. So we had our first international meeting then in 1991. Of the Institute for Functional Medicine that my wife and I put together to kind of bring this together, thinking that maybe we would get a few people to come and hang out with us. Now, it was very useful because Susan, being the meeting planner that she was able to get the Wailea Four Seasons Resort on Maui at $160 room rate.
Wow.
So we ended up with a really good a group of attendees that were looking for a nice vacation. So we had about 300 people come to the original meeting, but that kind of spawned then the start of functional medicine in the early 90s.
Wow, that's an amazing story. Davin, I can see you have your mind's turning. Go for it.
Yeah, well, so many questions. I think this idea of genetic sort of destiny, and how, to some extent we're still emerging from that, I think. And if you think about kind of the Western medicine approach, it was, well, let's find lots of pharmaceutical ways to sort of mitigate that destiny, right? In a way, right? Like as these symptoms show up, we'll try to treat it, we'll try to prolong your life, but, ultimately, it's sort of us against that. And it's interesting that you say your environmental sort of, you got started in environmental science. An environment is a very different approach to health, right? To the genetic sort of dogma, destiny. Do you think that had an impact on sort of helping you break free of that? I mean, you had a sense that it wasn't correct, but how did you really double down on that and have the courage to go against the, I think Bruce Lipton and others have talked about like how hard it was to change that thinking.
Well, David, I think you're right on target that this was an interesting transition for me because, first of all, I was not like your usual and customary chemistry professor. So that kind of ticked off some of my department members, senior members in my department, who wanted me to behave like a traditional chemistry professor, whatever that stereotype is. I was very fortunate because the president of the university, it's a private college, University of Puget Sound, the president of the university, who was new when I came, for whatever reason, liked me. And so he was kind of my defender against some of my department members, the tenured members that probably felt that I was breaking the mold and they didn't like it. Now, I had very high student evaluations, and that really, I think students liked my classes because they were always, I threw away my notes every year and start from scratch, and we'd all talk about topical things. So if I taught organic chemistry, it was from the organic chemistry of that year. I tried to bring things into it to make it more relevant. And I think that I had tremendous students during those years that went on to do great things and now many of them are retired, obviously, but they became really great professionals in their own life. And I think the president of the university liked whatever the way I was thinking, because it fit into a liberal arts college. So I taught in the philosophy department, I taught in the business school, I taught the history of science. I had relationships with all sorts of different faculty. And that was really good for my education, because it kept broadening my perspective and kept challenging me to think a little bit out of the box all along.
Yeah.
Now, the point for me, personally, that was really the Fisher cut bait, to use that allegory. I took a sabbatical in 1981 to 83 upon invitation by Linus Pauling to come and to run a research lab in his Institute for Science and Medicine in Palo Alto. Well, that was a life-changing experience on every level for me, because I got to know he and his wife, Eva Helen, very well. His office was actually right next to mine, so I had a lot of informal conversations with him over the 2 years. And when I finished up that 2-year experience, as I was packing up my boxes to go back to the car, my family is all waiting to drive back to Washington State from Palo Alto. I was holding I still remember this vividly. I was holding my boxes of books and stuff. And so Dr. Pauling was saying, well, Jeff, it's been great to have you here, and I hope we'll continue to collaborate. And, you've got a great future ahead of you. And I was thanking him. And then his last question to me was, so Jeff, I just wondered, do you think as you head back to your faculty position that your classroom is big enough? And so I got in the car and I had 1,100 miles to drive home. And it was just going through my head the whole time. What was this message? I mean, it was obviously.
Yeah.
And here is the point. I tell this story, and I don't think people actually, they believe I'm exaggerating, but I'm actually not exaggerating. On that drive back, with my kids in the car and my wife, I made the decision that I was going to give up my tenured faculty position, where I had the largest research group. I had been voted the top professor in the university for 2 years. I could teach anything I wanted, basically. And I was going to start this business to teach doctors how to do nutrition, medicine, and their practice. That was my business plan. But my father, who was retired at the time, aerospace engineer, couldn't believe that I was being so foolish. But after he got the vision that, I was pretty committed to wanting to do this, he said, okay, I guess I'm going to come out of retirement, because I started off with a degree in finance and accounting. So at least, I know something about business, nothing about it. So I'll be your business manager, which he did for the first 6 years. My wife became the corporate development person. My mother became our editor. And away I went to see if I could follow this passion. So, and the story worked out. It wasn't a linear path, but it was certainly, what do they say? Burning the boats. That was definitely burning the boats.
Oh my gosh, this is amazing. So many people. I mean, for you to be who you are in this space and yet have a pretty common story to, I think, a lot of people that will be listening to this podcast, of like, as Erik, the phrase Erik has coined of this, like, the first step is the hardest, right? And for you, even harder. I mean, at least those of us that are making the step, we're stepping into something that's pretty well developed now. But at your stage, selling nutrition to doctors, that sounds crazy. Back then, I'm sure.
So I'm curious I'm curious for you. Well, let me make a comment, because I want to recap, and then I'm going to ask you a question. But so I think there's some really interesting kind of things that happened along the way, right? One was you realized early on that who you were as a person was not fitting in the mold that had been created, right? And for you to be authentic to yourself, and I'm stealing thunder from Davin, because he's usually the one that brings this up, but and this is a theme we've seen across the board in all of our colleagues that we've had on, is that this sense of, this is not who I am, therefore I need to change the environment around me to match more of who I am, so that I can flourish in that environment, right? And it took you a little while to kind of figure out exactly what that, but you had a sense of that right from the beginning. And I think that was really important. And your life experiences guided you and prepared you, right? Being in environmental science, having gone to medical school, had that foundation. You had the first 2 years foundational principles of medicine kind of bored into you. And then you get into the environmental science world and see what was happening to the life of the planet. And I think it's really interesting talking about a resiliency aspect of how resilient that area of Puget Sound was that allowed it to it was trashed by that arsenic in that plant, but yet it has become revitalized. And I think that's just an important underpinning to what we're talking about here in terms of what happens when we allow the body and nature to actually have the influence of just being able to restore itself, the power of recreation within destruction, right? And so I think that those are just some points that I wanted to make. I'm curious to get your thoughts on what you think Linus Pauling would say if he was alive today and now could look and see what you've accomplished and where things are in terms of functional medicine and the way we're approaching medicine from a foundational approach, a systems biology approach. What do you think he would say if you were alive today?
I think he would be very pleased that I took his question seriously. That he and his wife were both extraordinary advocates for people achieving their potential. And, that wasn't just in science, that was in all the activities they did. His second Nobel Prize was in peace. And he felt that it should have been awarded to his wife because she was the one that really, in fact, there's an anecdote that I'll quickly share with you that I think symbolizes their relationship. And it's been a model that I thought about in my own life. So he was lecturing at Caltech to a group of, that was like an enclave, Caltech in the middle of Pasadena. And there was a lot of their board members that were in the defense industry because defense industry was very big in Southern California. And so he was lecturing about nuclear power and nuclear chemistry to the wives and family of people in the community. It was a night lecture for the community. And one of the questions of a woman in the audience after he finished his lecture was, Dr. Pauling, you're obviously an expert in this field of nuclear science and nuclear chemistry. What's your feeling about nuclear weapons and atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons? And he responded to her saying, well, that's an important question, but I wouldn't be the one to really answer that because, I'm a scientist. And if you ask me about the science of nuclear energy and so forth, I'd be able to, I think, adequately answer that. But that's really out of my area of expertise, so I don't feel comfortable in answering that. When he got off the stage, as the story is told to me by him, his wife, Eva Helen, was livid and said, Linus, what are you doing? When you answered that question, what are you doing? And he said, what do you mean? She said, you have strong opinions about this, and we talk about it all the time. And you kind of didn't express your thoughtful feelings about this. And if you're not willing to do that, you know more about this than 99% of the people on the planet, then what are you going to expect other people to do if you're not saying what's on your mind? And she said, I think until you kind of get clarity on this, there's going to be no more meals prepared by me at home. Which then I guess happened for some period of time until he recognized, that he really couldn't keep that position concealed. He had a responsibility. And then from then on, now we see pictures of him picketing around the White House back then in the 50s with placards saying, stop nuclear testing. One of my most privileged gifts that he gave me was a reproduction of a photograph that was made by his wife at Schweitzer's compound in Africa of Schweitzer, Einstein, and he at the table talking about how they were going to get 30,000 scientists to sign this proclamation of prohibiting nuclear atmospheric testing, which eventually was achieved.
Wow.
So there was a lot of advocacy that I learned from that experience that I had with him about how you start and stay true to a concept and the responsibility you have to it to maintain clarity.
One of my favorite authors is Dr. David Hawkins.
Oh, yeah.
And he references a book that he and Linus Pauling co-authored
Yes.
called Orthomolecular Psychiatry
Right.
in the early 70s, talking about, nutrition as a potential cure for psychiatric conditions.
With Abram Hoffer. And I had dinner with the three of them.
Oh my goodness.
And that was the start of the Orthomolecular Medical Association, which still exists today. And Richard Humer, who was a hugely successful psychiatrist in San Francisco, who was a very science-minded guy, was a principal. He was, I don't know the whole history, but he and his family were very financially successful. So they were able to fund a lot of the early development of the Orthomolecular Medical Association. And so there was actually a tribute in 1984, I think it was, or 3, in which Pauling, Hawkins, Hoffer, Humer, and others were all present, and a book was put together. I'm in that book, actually. There's a photograph of the people attending that meeting, and it was at the one of the major hotels in San Francisco. And here's this young guy embedded within people. Actually, also we had the one of the individuals who was responsible for a smallpox vaccination, because that was the year that the last person was vaccinated against the smallpox. And so there's a lot of interesting history here that's all woven together.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm in awe right now. This is so cool. And just a side note. So I did my residency in the Navy in Bremerton, Washington.
Oh boy!
And I rotated through the Army Hospital in Tacoma. So
I know it well, McCord. Yeah. And you were an officer and a gentleman out there in Bremerton. That was the movie.
Yes. Hopefully I was some of both of those. But yeah, I love that area. Is so beautiful. But that's really interesting that you were there at one point as well.
Well, I've done quite a bit of work on it at McCord and at the Air Force Hospital out as well. And it's, we did quite a bit of work back in Desert Storm, because there were a variety of service people that were really impaired coming back from Desert Storm neurologically. And we actually published a research paper on a number of them, and I actually presented to Congress the results of that research trial. That's a whole nother interesting story in my background. I was invited to attend this meeting with a variety of government officials from NIH and other departments involved with healthcare and the Veterans Administration. And one of the people from Harvard Med School, who is kind of a principal internist, but he's a principal investigator in chronic fatigue syndrome, published quite a few papers on CFS. So we had this long discussion as to whether there was such thing as Desert Storm syndrome as a consequence of exposure to burn piles and toxins and so forth. And I thought there was a very, very strong, we had evidence from these patients that had been seen, and many of them were high-ranking officers that were totally disabled after Desert Storm, who came into the situation as, high-performing ultra athletes, and they were just totally disabled afterward. And we presented this a small cohort of individuals. I think we had 16 people in our study. And at the end of that meeting, it was in Boston. Oh man, I still remember this. We walked out of the hotel, and it was rush hour. I had to get to Logan Airport to fly home. And there was another person standing at the street corner trying to get a cab to get to the airport, who, as turned out, was the executive director of the Institute for Environmental Health for the government. And he said, "Hey, if we get a cab, can we share it? Because I'm not going to get a separate cab. It's too crazy." So we ended up sharing this cab, and it was traffic jam. So we spent a lot of time in the cab getting to the airport. And
Oh man.
to distill down the conversation, the takeaway was he said to me, he said, "So Jeff, I think you know that the evidence that was provided at this meeting we had today was irrefutably strongly in support of the fact that there was something that happened, an exposure that created a toxic events to the nervous system in these individuals. We don't know exactly what it is, but there's no doubt that that is the case. However, it is equally the case that this will never be known, because the political economic implications of making this known to a field that doesn't know how to diagnose or treat it would only end up creating a greater problem. So yes, you were right, but no, it's not going to go anywhere." That was my takeaway.
Wow.
So that was another lesson, right? That all these kind of stack on one another.
Yeah, no, it's true. And people come, we come into contact with people all the time who will influence us and help shape the way that we think and perform. And I want to go back a little bit to the people that were around you. And one of the things that I realized early on in my career in terms of being entrepreneurial and establishing something that was more unique to me was sharing that vision with others. And then in doing so, it kind of attracted people, drew people to me that then could help me along that way. And, how interesting would it have been if you had just kept your thoughts to yourself on your way back from Palo Alto to Tacoma and thought, wow, I wonder what he meant by that. But then you just got back into the rhythm of life and just let things go. And you didn't share what you were thinking, right? Clearly that stirred within you something that was pulling you into your mission in this life, right? That you felt like this was drawing you out of where you were. And as you started to have that conversation with Susan, that she already was kind of pushing you in that direction anyways. All it did was validate what she was already feeling about where you could go. Tell us a little bit about the influence then that your dad and Susan and others had in helping you be successful, because there was certainly challenges that came along the way. It wasn't easy to get started. Tell us about the influence of others and the impact that had on you.
Yeah, I was so fortunate, because when we put this, when Susan organized this meeting in 1989 in Victoria, the people we invited, people were like Leo Gallen and Sid Baker and Joe Pizzorno and Graham Reedy. And it was really a laundry list of extraordinarily thoughtful, insightful, creative, out-of-the-box thinkers. But also very disciplined. Not flighty, people that really did the heavy lifting. And when you put those talents together, you did a mind meld over 2 years, it created a synthesis that was, to me, quite special. When I look back, I would call that maybe the seminal event in my life as in terms of creation, because we started with a blank. We started with nothing. We didn't start with any kind of expectation at all. It was just whatever would happen, we'll find out. And I think it was that group of individuals that really, I was maybe the keeper of that information. I wasn't the person who just designed it de novo.
Right.
And we collaborated and I had the advantage at that point, fortunately, because I'd been, by that time, more than 10 years out of academics and starting a business. I had an income stream that my wife and I could dedicate to funding the startup of IFM. And over the first few years, I think we probably put $2 to $3 million into getting IFM institutionalized. Now, we could have never done that if I would have not had the world wouldn't have given me that money. I had to earn the right to do that. And so I think the whole thing is very organic when I think about it. It was built out of a movement with an objective in mind as to what we were trying to do, not knowing where we were going really, but the objective where we wanted to go was very clear.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that. So speaking of where we want to go, let's shift now to today and where functional medicine is and where you think it's going. You and Chris Magrita and I had the opportunity to just share some thoughts through email in regards to really something you initiated after having attended a gala for Function Health, and kind of how they're disrupting the medicine world right now, which is fantastic. And so why don't you just lead us into a bit of a conversation there about how where you think functional medicine is now, and what some of these new technologies, from AI to biomarkers to genetics, are kind of pushing us in. And in our conversation, you had mentioned we're at this pivot point where we're moving away from this reactive healthcare to more of a predictive healthcare, right? And we're moving away from diagnosis and now more into prognosis, really kind of looking at that perspective. So maybe give us a few thoughts that you've had on that.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. I think this is a critical point in human history relative to not just medicine and healthcare, but the whole nature of how information transfers itself through culture to create change. And I think that's a consequence of several intersecting revolutions that are all forming a mega revolution.
Mm-hmm.
So first, we have the concept of digital technology. And so digital technology can build itself into all sorts of tools, like wearable devices, like informatics, like biometrics, like the things that we can measure, in our, like, I bought a $25, I think it was on sale for $25 kind of in-body scale that measures all sorts of things: my body composition, my percent body fat, my percent water. Here for $25 is a algorithmically sophisticated instrument that we would call a scale, that's actually a biomonitor of my physical health. And all of these things are becoming available now with the convergence of these different technologies. Then we say, okay, that's great. Now we have all this information, but what the heck do we do with it? Because it's like a tsunami. And so fortunately, at the same time, we have the development of machine learning and artificial intelligence, which can absorb and digest enormous amounts of data in unbelievably short periods of time. And we also have now satellites, and we can do cloud computing, and we can beam anywhere in the world large amounts of data that have been interpolated so that you can be real time understanding your physiology in a way that never any human being previously was able to. You want to talk about empowering people. Now, a lot of people will say today, I really don't want to know that information. I like to just turn my body over to my doctor and they can just tell me what to do when I need to. That's a kind of resonant feeling. But these technologies, like the telephone, like the fax machine, like the TV, they slip in. At first, people like the automobile replacing the buggy. Like, who wants that smoky, loud thing? I like my horse. That's my friend. I don't want that stupid thing out there and making pollution. But now we're seeing this technology shifting in across all classes, across all socioeconomic demographics. So that it will change. Person won't even know that their body is being monitored, because it'll be just part of life. It'll be part of the information that just travels with us. It's almost like what's happened with the transportable medical record.
Yep.
I mean, that's a huge, huge paradigm shift in itself. And now people expect that. They expect to have their medical data available. They expect to be able to take it to another physician if they want to. That is totally alien 15 years ago. And so these things happen, by tsunamis that ultimately, when they pull back, leave on the beach new things. And so I think what's happening right now is the empowerment of the individual and the ability then for healthcare providers to be able to use their training and their background and their wisdom in ways to be what doctors are supposed to be: teachers, guides, motivators, supporters, visionaries, people there to listen, to take away fear, to help navigate the trajectory of life that's more than just information. And that's not been a major part of medical school education, but I think it's going to become, because it is the missing link that separates a computer from a sentient person sitting there talking to somebody. And so I'm quite encouraged. I think, however, we will go through some rough spots, because this is a huge major paradigm shift to all institutions, insurance companies, and Medicare, reimbursement, tracking, finance, institutions, building large buildings, all stuff is influenced by this. And then you tie that to the existential, life-threatening risk we have now of ultra-processed diets. Mm-hmm. I want to impress that this is a absolute risk to the human survival. If you look at what's happened in sperm counts in males, and to ovarian disorders in females, it is now projected that by 2050, we will have more births born by IVF than we will by normal mechanisms of fertility.
That's crazy.
And so the construct that the human being could be wiping away its own fertility, and where does that come from? Well, we'd say there's a variety of things, toxins and stress, but our diet is a major determinant of feeding stuff that's dangerous to us. And the effects of this uncontrolled study, of which there's no placebo blind, the results are coming in, and it's not that good. It's pretty scary. And people are still looking the other way. And it starts with new agriculture. It starts with new methods of converting foods into final products and making them shelf stable. It comes into making health as an attribute for food, not just production and quantity and price.
Well, and going back to your, experience with the smelter, right? Getting rid of that influence can then allow nature to get back on course and recreate something that is life-sustaining, beautiful, healthy. And so it's not the end of the world that we've been exposed to this. The end of the world is that we continue being exposed to it, right? That's really kind of the trajectory that we're on.
Let me give a short personal anecdote to this. So I did what my wife didn't want me to do here about 5 years ago. I started another company, Big Bull Health. And the reason I started is that I really wanted to focus on immune system function and the relationship to diet, and see if I could learn stuff about the immune system and what we were feeding the immune system. That ultimately led me into two things I never thought in my life I would ever be doing. One of which is being part owners of regenerative agriculture farms in upstate New York that are growing this crop that had been lost in America some 150 years ago, called Tartary buckwheat, a unique form of buckwheat that has about 100 times the level of immune active phytochemicals of normal buckwheat. And the other was this unique fish oil family that I ran into a guy that owned an Alaskan fishing company, was housed in Seattle. And we started to produce this fish oil by the boats he designed, which catch fish on a line and hook one at a time. And they get frozen from live fish into frozen products on board the ship in like 20 minutes. And then we built a plant to never get that stuff above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, so it doesn't lose any of the natural ingredients. And we ended up, when we did the analysis of that oil, it was different than other oils, because it turns out that fish oils that we're supplementing people today is an ultra-processed food. And it's, people are worried about seed oils. They should be worried about fish oils, because they are undergoing all sorts of processes that the sea oils are going through. And so what I learned through this process is I got down to farmers. I got down to fishermen. I got down to villagers in Alaska who work damn hard to try to eke out a living doing really good things. And we just got back from the farms with one of our people visiting our farmers, and she came back in tears. She's saying, these people are so committed to the soil. They're so committed to survive, their families are raised around the ethos of survivability, of sustainability. It's what they are driven by. And these are family farms, not large, mega farms, but that's why they're in farming, because they have this calling. They like all the uncertainties of the weather and all the dealings with nature. And the same, it goes through for when I was in Dutch Harbor, Alaska 3 weeks ago, and I saw the same thing with the people who work on our boats. And I came in with one of the crews from the Mariner Navigator, one of our boats that had been out for 38 days fishing. And these guys that were on that boat were so excited that they were producing a different kind of product, that they were sustaining, and they weren't throwing stuff away. They weren't making a mess. And so these value systems somehow have to be permeating everything we do. They are really important guides for us in how we behave.
That's beautiful. I think there is, at a broader level, since the pandemic, like this healthy skepticism of status quo, right? And I think because of everything that happened there, and so many people were impacted by that event, that it did, I feel like, move people in more of this direction of, hey, I need to advocate for my own health, because I can't always completely trust, fair or unfair, the system to take care of me. And so I love hearing, stories like that. Do you feel like there's a broader sort of population movement in this direction to get these things corrected?
Yeah, Davin, I think what you just said is really important. I really want to underline what you just said. I think it's very, very powerful lesson or message. I do believe that it's happening. People they're confronted with the realities of the cost of food going up, with not being able to afford a lot of things and being in debt. And there's so much uncertainty, and uncertainty builds fear. Fear is not a really great emotion to be living with, because fear produces an alarm response. We become intolerant to our world. We become intolerant to our own bodies. And now we have the dysfunctions of intolerance, which is inflammation. And we have more autoimmune disease, and we have more inflammatory conditions. All this kind of fits together into a social nexus, I think. So I believe what you're saying is really, really important. It's probably the key. Before we start talking about, well, how do you treat the following condition? We need to go back to the social structure in which we're living and say, how do we create something that allows us to be tolerant to the environment in which we find ourselves, so that we don't feel at risk, so we don't feel unsafe, so we don't feel in alarm, and therefore we fight back with intolerance. And intolerance cuts across all sorts of different uses of that word, I believe, from cellular biology to social structure.
So kind of piggybacking on what Davin was saying in terms of, I think in general, from a population standpoint, there does seem to be this craving, thirsting for more knowledge on how to become more healthy, right? And this shift from, as we were just talking about, this reactive state of medicine, where now I've come in and I'm well down the path of disease process. Now I get an intervention versus, hey, is there something I can find out early to know whether I'm going to develop Alzheimer's? Or is there something going on with me that's going to prevent me from, or it's going to predict me to having cancer or cardiovascular disease? Is there something we can do to identify that now and shift things so that I can actually have a better outcome than what maybe my genes are telling me and what my doctors are telling me, right? And so I feel like there's been this kind of shift. So how do you think we can, because at least it still feels like in the world of medicine, the dogma still seems to be stuck and not wanting to move forward. But do you think the shift in medicine is going to come more from people saying, "Hey, this is what I'm demanding, this type of healthcare, so I'm just going to go to doctors that are doing this," or do you think it's going to be more technology just driven, where it's now we have access to all this information and we have AI kind of processing it, and now if you're not a doctor that's understanding this, you're going to be left behind in the dust? Or do you think this is more of financial? Like there's now, investors that are really wanting to get on the early stages of this and invest money into this, so that they can continue to move this forward? Or is it all three? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it is all three, Eric. I think what you said is exactly, you described the landscape of change that we're working in right now. And nothing, I said to people, and it sounds like an exaggeration, but I really don't think it is. I said, whatever you believed yesterday, you might as well forget, because we are creating tomorrow. And tomorrow is only going to be partially built out of yesterday. This is one of those pinch points in human history, of which there are a few. If you study human history, there are these epic periods where there are seismic shifts in culture, world culture. And that's happening right now. Now, I don't have omniscience to know exactly how this is going to work out, but I do know without any question, it is that time of which this change will take things that we considered truths and alienable, institutionally fixed situations, be it economic, stock market, businesses, politics, regulatory affairs. All of those are going to change, all of them. And I think how they change will depend upon how people want this to change, because in the end, change always occurs from the outside in. I don't believe there are good examples ever in any culture of inside out change, where it comes from the institution to try to change itself. Now, how that occurs, is it endorsed in such a way that is peaceful and is it has an acknowledged value proposition? As they say, history progresses one funeral at a time. So will it occur naturally, or will it be imposed? I think that's always the battle with human cultural changes. As to, if you look what's going on in Ukraine, I mean, you can choose so many hot spots in the world to say, right, these are all where these battles are occurring. So I think we stay tuned. Now, at 80 years of age, will I be around long enough to fully see how this transitions? I don't know. I'd like to think I could see some of this coming out to where people were treating one another differently, but I know it will change regardless of me or not.
Yeah, well, I think we're getting a sense of that already. I think that there is certainly a feeling, a sentiment, a movement within society to try and overcome some of these fractionated, hateful, disruptive movements to try and control the world. I think there's this other movement that's fighting against that and trying to protect against that. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. But I feel optimistic and confident that things are continuing to get better.
Let me say one last thing today, because I think what you just said is really positive. For the healthcare practitioners of the world who are very worried about all these changes that are occurring, what I would say is that there is always going to be an extraordinary need for well-trained medical professionals who are connected to patients in ways that deliver value to them and their outcome. There will always be need, and that value will probably go up as we get more technology, not go down. And so if a person says, I don't know how I'm going to make a living because I've been making a living on a certain set of ICDs and DRGs and filling out forms, and yeah, that's right. That's the start of the next thing where you say, driving home from Palo Alto, that you're going to do something different. And lo and behold, the world will protect you, because if you start with a high passion, you will find a way. I'm just absolutely convinced of that.
Yep, I totally agree. Well, Davin, you want to bring us home here? And we're coming up on an hour. We're finish this up with a last comment and a question?
Well, we often ask people around the future of kind of where they see things going. And I think we've already touched on that a little bit. So maybe I'll ask you a slightly different question, which is for our maybe other, people like me who are, have taken that first step or are considering that first step of moving into a more functional, holistic, integrative model. What advice or inspiration could you, share to maybe nudge them along the way?
Well, I think the key is to hang out with the right people, because you need a peer group. You need a safe harbor. And I was very fortunate when we started this, as I mentioned, to have a really great group of peers that made me better than I was, and knocked down some of the fear that I was going to fail. And so I think that finding the right peer group and grooming that peer group that you can trust, and you can contribute to them and they contribute to you, is a really, really important, because it's not going to come probably from your traditional medical society. It's going to come from some subset of individuals that share a different vision, that are going to collegially change what's going on. Once you have that, it builds your confidence. And with confidence, I think humans can do the unexpected.
So very, very true. Well, thank you again, Dr. Bland. This has been an exceptional conversation, and I'm sure anyone who listens to this will be inspired, educated, uplifted, and motivated to continue on in the world of medicine and in the world in general to make it a better place. So thank you very much.
Well, Erik and Davin, thank you. I think this has really been for me a treat. And just, I feel very privileged to be even able to tell this story, which is just one life in the sea of many. So thank you.
Thank you for all you've done.